Elizabeth Kim.
Hello, how are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay,
you
awesome.
sound fantastic as usual.
Likewise.
We just give people a minute to drift in here. Elizabeth. Are you still in New York? Did you go south? Where are you? Where are you in the world, Elizabeth Kim? You're on mute. There's a button.
Oh, there we go. Okay, figured it out. I'm in New York City.
Awesome. I hear air quality is on the decline.
Not great. There's my air purifier right there in the background. So
Blowing directly on you.
basically, I've been angling it towards myself everywhere I go in my rooms.
And you just got back from some travel, right?
Yep, I've been traveling for over a month without an itinerary across Europe. So that was a bit of a social experiment in itself because I'm usually very type A planner, get everything down on the ground, and I wanted to try something different. So yeah, that was a whole adventure. So I'm still kind of in vacation brain mode, caveat to everybody.
Did you find yourself like falling into old planning behaviors, or were you able to successfully resist? How did you change your behavior? Tell us about.
I think I actually held well to it. Part of what happens, I realized, is that when you don't have a plan, things happen very, like things are on fire all the time, kind of. And so even if you try to sit and plan for a while, you kind of can't because you have like basic survival things to handle. So I found that it's as useful to plan as it isn't useful to plan because a train had flipped at one point on a track that I was on, and we all had to evacuate, and they abandoned us on top of some random mountain. Then it started hailing. It was crazy. And had I planned out, hotels and everything, I would have wasted a lot of money that day. But because I didn't have a plan, I was fine. I just got stranded in some city and got hostel there. So, yeah, as useful as it isn't useful is the takeaway that I learned.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. These are always a really informal chats. It's going to be just you and I talking. Folks, for those who haven't come before, you can always ask questions or raise your hand using the comment and raise hand buttons at the bottom. This is recorded, so if you don't want your face to be shown, turn off the recording. Generally, we just zoom it to Elizabeth and I, and that's what we post on YouTube and other channels. But be aware that it is recorded. Feel free to ask questions as you go. We'll try and get to them as we can. Otherwise, it'll be a lovely chat between me and my old friend Elizabeth Kim. So Elizabeth, we always kind of start at the very beginning. So you can give a 2-second overview of who you are, but you should know I'm going to start by sort of telling, I'm going to get to you at the very beginning of your behavioral science journey, and then we're going to go from there. So Miss Elizabeth Kim, would you like to introduce yourself to our friendly audience?
Yes, the 2-second version is that I'm a behavioral scientist. Started off in the academic world, went over to jet.com/Walmart, and then spent the past 4 years at Spotify, really jumping into experimentation, behavioral science, and bringing that into product development. I also had a stint in politics, which was an interesting chapter that fit also into the whole behavioral science umbrella. Because, God knows the government could use a bit of social science evidence in their policies. And so yeah, I'm on the other side now. I'm on sabbatical and kind of spending this time just simmering, reflecting. I'm planning to get a bunch of stuff out from things that I had observed. So yeah, that's where I am today.
This is the first of the stuff out opportunities. See, we get to talk about all of your new thoughts. You've had a little bit of an interesting career because, more so than I think a lot of behavioral scientists, you've been at very consumer focused companies, right? A lot of folks end up, like Stephen at sort of Morningstar or other places that are, even Clover Health. It's not, consumer in the same sort of direct buying way. Whereas Jet, Walmart, Spotify, there's that sort of consumer emphasis. So take us all the way back. I know you grew up in the South. Like, Where did behavioral science, like you woke up one day and were like, yeah, I'm going to do this thing. Like, tell us the origin story. I like origin.
Yeah, going all the way back. It all started when I was growing up in the rural South. A bit Minari-esque, you could put it that way. It's nice to have like a reference point to point to nowadays. But yeah, growing up in the rural South, and I lived this sort of double life where I ghost rode as a middle-aged man selling concrete cutting saws. And so essentially, it was for my dad, who didn't speak English very well. He would make and invent these awesome machines that cut concrete, and basically, I would pretend to be him. And so I had a childhood where I was at the same time a 12-year-old girl navigating, the roughness of being an outsider in the South in a rural area. But at the same time, by night, I was suddenly this powerful man who had influence, who could make business calls and decisions and negotiations and make big deals and things like that. And so suddenly it dawned on me that so much of life is about perception. Like, perception is 9/10 reality, I think, is the quote that people often use. But having lived that, I realized just how crazy it was that people were responding so differently to me, even though I was the same 12-year-old girl in either situation, but simply because they thought of me as like a big middle-aged man, with a concrete cutting saw business. I could do so much more. And so I got really into understanding perception and why people do what they do, think what they think, have the biases that I have and the prejudices and all of those things. And of course, there was this inner desire to kind of want to change some of those things, because I was facing a lot of discrimination and racism, everything from, the microaggressions of where are you really from, all the way to, being physically at harm. And so all of those things kind of came together. And so then I was in college. Duke was my dream school. I didn't know behavioral science even existed at the time, but I had a meaningful conversation with Dan Ariely, and then we ran an experiment on meaningful conversations. And part of it was a way to test and figure out, what if we stripped away like all the biases that you could possibly have on a person, get strangers to connect, and you take away your ability to look at them so you don't know their gender or their race or their age or anything at all. Like, could we bring people together and get them to have more meaningful, deeper interactions if you strip those away, also get them to sign a social contract, and then see if we can build an app that can do that and scale out that impact? And so that was a pivotal moment for me where I realized, one, somehow you can get funding to do these sorts of fun, crazy things. I really felt guilty for like a solid 3 months. I felt like I was like lying to Duke and cheating them, of like I've somehow like tricked them into funding my playground. But it worked out, and then the results, are valuable, and you can build that into products and scale. And that was the aha moment where it was like, oh, this is a really awesome, valuable thing that you can do out in the world, that the world needs more of, because experimentation opens possibilities.
I'm going to pause you. That was a lot. So I got to ask some questions so that we break it down. So you didn't know Dan and behavioral science and stuff at Duke. Why Duke? Like, what sort of made you pick this as a place to be?
It's a very random story. Actually, I was, I think, 5 or 6 at the time, about to get my first pair of glasses. So I'm at the lens crafters in like the local mall, and the optometrist sat me down. He was like, "What do you want to be when you grow up, young lady?" And told him, "I want to be a brain surgeon." Obviously, didn't happen, but behavioral science, brains still work
I
out.
don't know. You kind of are messing. I like it. You're rerouting people's brains. Learning is rerouting people's brains.
We're good.
Type of surgery. I'll take it.
Yeah. And so he was like, "Oh, wow. Well, Duke University has a cool medical school." And he pulled out a brochure. I don't know why he had that on hand, but it had this like cool train that was like on this, it was like a racetrack. It looked like the Jetsons kind of, and it just looked so cool and futuristic. And I was like, I have to go there. And then I got there and the train wasn't there anymore, but it was still good.
Childhood disappointment. And so you get to Duke, and were you a psych major? Like, how did you end up sort of getting to Dan? Did you seek him out? You sort of, it was happenstance. Like, how did that initial sort of spark part happen?
Yeah, that was also one of those sort of non-linear journeys, because looking back, I would say most of what I've done in my career, I learned from stepping away from school as opposed to being in school. So I was halfway, well, I started off college with a giant existential crisis because I had interned with a neurosurgeon and shadowed, and that was awesome. Brain surgeries, open spines, and everything. But when I see people physically in pain, I would empathize, and then I would end up getting sick. And it's not great when two people are passing out in a hospital room. So kind of just got there, and I was like, oh my gosh, I spent my whole life, thinking I would become a neurosurgeon, and suddenly like everything is unraveled, and I thought getting to Duke would solve everything. I was the first in my family to go to college, so it was a really big deal, and it always just felt like this far away thing that you could never achieve, but then you get there and you figure everything will solve itself, and then you realize, oh, it's just the beginning. And so big existential crisis that helped a lot, and I was just like, I don't want to get stuck in the Sisyphean cycle of setting a goal, reaching it, setting another goal, reaching it, and then never feeling fulfilled. So I was just like, I'm going to figure out the meaning of life. And I realized the thing that really brought me joy was having like meaningful conversations with people and meaningfully connecting with them. So I did this sort of crazy thing where I forgot about grades, accomplishments, everything. And I was just like, I am only going to optimize for this one variable. And that got me talking to a lot of different people around the school, around the area. At first, I thought it meant, okay, documentary studies, that's what I got to do. And so I started getting a certificate that got me to talk to people. But then I realized I hate video editing. It is one of the most painful things in the world. But I loved, the essence of capturing people's stories and then understanding what systematic problems there are in society to find ways to then use people's voices and make systematic change. And then, along the way of trying to figure out the meaning of life, I was like, an app for meaningful conversations, which started out as a joke. It's when Tinder was starting to form. And so I posted a thing online and I was like, there's Tinder, and then there's Bark Buddy, which is a Tinder for dogs. There was like a Tinder for platonic cuddling out in parks. And I was like, this is crazy. So why don't we have, a Tinder for meaningful conversations? And then it kind of hit off in the local community. And I was like, you know what, let's do it. And I remember I was trying to convince Dan to sponsor me for a program too, which at Duke is like a create your own major thing. So I wanted to combine documentary and behavioral science, but he kept saying like, he wasn't really like excited about it. We were just like, yeah, no, that's not going to work. And then at the very end, I sort of just was like, well, I have this project that I wanted to do as my capstone for it. Could I at least get your feedback? It's this app for meaningful conversations. And then suddenly everything changed. As I was leaving, he sent me an email as I was walking, and he got really excited. We started brainstorming, but he had another meeting, so I was like, okay, we'll meet again. I'm walking out, and as he's in this meeting, he shoots me a message, and he's like, hey, if you want my help, you have it. And then it kind of kicked off from there, because to make the app, we wanted to run an experiment to really, empirically validate ways to make it work. And so that's kind of how it had kicked off. And then I kept running experiments at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and halfway through, I took a sabbatical or student sabbatical, I would say, and I joined the lab full time for almost a year. It was about like 7 months. And so basically I was just living, breathing, experimentation, also working with the Fabulous, which is a habit formation app. And so that gave me this really great back and forth of like talking with academic researchers, running empirical studies, but then getting to run to a product that had, at that point, they had like a couple million users, maybe 1 million users. Now they're at like, I don't know, tens of millions. They've really grown. But getting to apply those insights, run a test, get results in like literally a few days, and being able to go back and forth in that cycle was something that was so exciting to me. So that experience let me understand, okay, here are the skill sets that I need to be able to move forward. So I went back to school for the remaining 1.5 years, and I just stocked up on all the classes that I needed to kind of fill it. But I had the framework, which was really helpful from having that like real world experience of applying behavioral science to government, health, businesses, that kind of thing.
A couple of things I want to extract in there. So, I think we talk about these 6 behavioral science roles, right? Leader, strategist, quant qual, designer, and PM. You got a little chance to play in each of those. And I love that you started with sort of the documentary, a lot of UX researchers come from a sort of reporting or documentary, like that individual storytelling sort of thing. And then they start to drift up, right? So you had this, hey, I'm going to have a bunch of meaningful conversations. Then you start to see patterns, right? You start to see this sort of like, oh, there's something larger here. You got to do the PM thing, right? Because you got to run an experiment to see, how to have meaningful conversations happen. You got to sort of do that in the world. So you got to move through these pieces. You have, I think, also sort of uniquely, I like your factorial approach to sort of how do we do behavioral science, and I want to talk a little bit about that later, which is a very quantitative way in some ways of thinking about behavioral science. Did you take quant in undergrad? Did computer science, like those sorts of things? Like, where did that sort of appreciation of maybe the more mathematical element come in?
Yeah, there are a couple pieces. So before I had my sabbatical, which is when, I really figured out, okay, these are the classes I need to take to like fill the gaps. Before that, there was sort of a thing at Duke. There's like a big feud between the psychology department and the statistics department. So if you take like Stats 101 from either, they just don't accept it. So they force you to take Stats 101 twice if you want to take advanced stats classes. So I had like, double the Stats 101. And then in high school, there was AP statistics. And so in some ways I ended up taking Stats 101 3 times because of bureaucratic political feuds. And so I think that set like a really strong foundation for the quantitative appreciation. And then afterwards it was, filling in the quantitative things, and also just running experiments at the lab where, there are times where you want an experiment and it's very clear that there's just like one thing to change, but oftentimes there's just so many questions, and they're really good questions, really great hypotheses, and you might want to test, how 2 things affect a thing. And so to get to answering more than one thing at a time, then you want to get into sort of the factorial space. And so I think one reason why I've always been more, like just thinking about that more and doing it more is simply because at the companies that I've been at, there have always been millions of users. And so that lends its way to having larger sample sizes and being able to do that. It would really never make too much sense for like a, startup that's just starting out with a product. And so I think that's another big factor in the way I think the BeSci role kind of plays out depending on the scale of the specific environment that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the Fabulous, as you talked about, had a million folks running around. It's not 10 people, right? We're at this point where you can do something meaningful. So you get through college, you work at the lab, you get through college. What happens then, right? You go out, you start with an existential crisis, then you graduate, which is usually the next existential crisis called, how do I get a job? Like, tell us about that moment. Like, sort of how does that unfold for you?
Yeah, I think a huge part of it was stubbornness, because I had talked to a lot of people in the field. I did this sort of like sojourn out into San Francisco where I just, found up a bunch of people doing related things and asked about their experiences, which really kind of, opened my eyes to the field and like the importance of it. But yeah, a large part of it was stubbornness, because I do remember, a number of people saying, like, don't pursue behavioral science on its own. The roles don't exist. Like, just be a product manager, be a user researcher, and then come in with behavioral science as like your superpower, which, I don't think is bad advice. I think it's great advice. But I just was very stubborn because I had seen it play out and the value of it. And just, fundamentally, everyone just wants to know like what works for who and why. And behavioral science gives you the tools to be able to answer that. And when you can answer that and build out a system that answers that, you can basically solve anything in the world, since 99% of problems actually boil down to human behavior, as we're all very aware of here. And so yeah, that was kind of the setup for that. And so
I'm going to pause you here one
yes.
second, though. You have ageless beauty. And so I should have clarified for people along this journey, when did you graduate? So where in the story, because behavioral science has changed, right? Even how we approach behavioral science, whether there are roles or aren't roles, or how you get into an organization, these all changed. And so you really came about at a time where it was not yet popularized. So when you're doing this graduation, you graduated in
2017.
There you go. So as you're contextualizing this in the greater field of behavioral science, right? 2017, there are people who are doing things. There are teams that are out there, but it's not certainly prolific. It's not like it is today. There weren't nearly as many consultancies at the time in terms of sort of applying it, which, you saw a lot of seed for a lot of companies bringing it in-house. So you go out and people say, don't go for a role that has it in the name. And you say, bah, humbug. And just say, I'm Elizabeth Kim. And then
And then, well, yeah, LinkedIn search didn't really pull up behavioral science roles back then, unless it was like a psychiatric sort of thing, which I'm not at all qualified to do. So in the very beginning, I got really, really lucky. One of the alumni from the Center for Advanced Hindsight had started a role as a data scientist at jet.com. And she gave this really great presentation on behavioral economics, and everyone in the company got super excited. And they're like, yes, we want more of this. Let us give you an intern. And so before she had reached out, I mean, I had no idea any of that was going on at the time. I was just like basically applying to, I think, user research roles, and then just kind of doing my thing and sort of pitching things. And yeah, at the time I was trying to like sort of form it into this one thing, but then it was when Marve reached out that I was just like, oh wow, that's kind of a perfect opportunity. And that was right during like the internship cycle. So I had a summer internship as a behavioral science intern. We ran some experiments, everybody loved it, and then it turned into a full-time role. And then after a little over a year, Spotify reached out, and then that also turned into a behavioral science role. And then, they had larger sample sizes. It just made sense to progress. So that's where things led.
Oh, nice try. You really glossed over a lot in there. We're going to go back and we're going to dig in. So you're at Jet as an intern. You come on full time in data science. Like, where are they putting this for? Like, where in the organization are you living? What's your remit? How do you get projects? Like, how is this sort of coming to life at Jet? And this is
Yeah.
pre-Walmart acquisition, I think.
This was like almost immediately right after the Walmart acquisition. So it was at a stage where, Jet was still, I think when I joined, it must have been like 700 people. So it wasn't huge. It was like medium size, I guess, and everything's so relative. So my medium is probably very different from other people's mediums. But so that was kind of the setup, but it was like a very weird, I mean, probably the most extreme juxtaposition you can get in the business world, because Walmart is a Fortune 1 company. It is the largest company in the world. And yet you're in a startup at the same time. It was very like Schrodinger's cat. You're kind of both at the same time. But for all intents and purposes, like, the Jet work was within the Jet ecosystem. So it was still a very startup experience, albeit with just more funding, which is nice. So I guess it was like, best of both worlds kind of situation. So given that, actual Jet was about 600 people, there was a research team. And so okay, so kind of sorry, I'm going back in time, also trying to remember the structure. So there was the analytics and insights group, the larger group, which was data science and research. And then within that, we also had an experimentation. We had like product managers and engineers. So it was actually really cool that the insights team had actual engineers, and we built the experimentation platform with MIT. And so it's really unusual, I think, for insights to have that kind of leverage. And so that's happening. And then within that, there was also a research team. And on the research team were user researchers. And then I was like the first kind of pilot behavioral scientist on that team. But we all worked together. And so we were kind of like a centralized, I guess, unit that worked on various projects around the company, since insights resources were, I guess, I mean, everyone needs research. And then it's not like there were 50 hundreds of researchers or anything like that. It was like a small like quad of us. So that was kind of the context.
Got it. So lots of demand organically in the organization,
Yeah.
and you're sort of choosing between projects to figure out where to put those resources across what sounds like a very multidisciplinary team. You mentioned quant, you mentioned qual, right? You've got, PMs and engineers, so you can run pilots and things, and sort of do experimentation at larger scale, which you're right, I mean, is unique. We're here, 7 years later, 6 years later, still a lot of folks haven't figured that out, right? There's, UX researchers are very isolated from their data science counterparts. There's not, they don't have access to project managers and engineers to build experimentation, right? They have to sort of beg, borrow, and steal, right? So this is pretty progressive. So you're there, and then Spotify reaches out and says what? Like, the head behavioral science, we're really committed, we know what this is, and we definitely are sure what we're buying. Like, how does Spotify sort of start to make the pitch to you?
Yeah, so it was a version almost of a recapitulation of like the first sort of jump that got me started at Jet. There was someone who had been a research assistant at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and she had started out her career as a user researcher there, and like loved behavioral science, and we had just kind of kept in touch over the years. And so she was like, you know, getting into things. There was a new role that had formed, and she thought of me and reached out. And initially, it was a user research role, but they wanted someone who had more behavioral science. So at first, I wasn't like super excited. I was more so just kind of going through the motions of interviewing to just see what's out there, you know, stay up to date, that kind of thing. But what was unexpected was halfway through, it was a very long interview process. Halfway through, they were like, actually, we decided to turn this into a behavioral science role, and we want to turn this into a new practice in our insights world. And so yeah, at that point, the like thing that I signed at the end to actually join was a behavioral scientist role. And that was very exciting, you know, larger sample size, all the things. It was hard to leave though, because I felt like at that point at Jet, like things were really starting to kind of, you know, get going. But a lot of mentors were pushing me to go forward. And in hindsight, it ended up being a great decision because Jet doesn't exist anymore. Like giant Walmart politics, they cut off their entire e-commerce world. They just kind of like sucked talent and then cut things off. So it was actually amazing timing. So that was really lucky.
But there's a couple of aspects of that I really like. I mean, one, the fact that you noted, hey, I was always kind of interviewing. I was always paying attention. You know, I'm paying attention to the job market, which I think something, you know, something every behavioral scientist should be doing. You got to see what's out there and how the other people are thinking about it. Even if you're not going to go take those roles, you know, it behooves you to have those conversations. And then the fact that you didn't, you know, there's a way in which early Elizabeth Kim in her stubbornness might have been like, no, it's a user research role. I say no. Right. But instead you sort of engaged in the process and then it flipped. Do you have a sense of did it flip because of conversations with you? It flipped because of internal politics? It like what sort of turned the key that they went, oh, maybe we want this to be behavioral science forward footed rather than user research forward footed?
Yeah, it had been the conversations because the interviews were different in that usually in interviews they're kind of like analyzing you and trying to like evaluate you in terms of like a criteria that they already have. But the thing is that behavioral science is a whole separate criteria. It's a separate paradigm. And so a lot of those interviews were actually me sort of playing like an educational role. It was kind of like walking them through experiments that I had done, the process, what it means, how to do it, those implications to Spotify. And so I remember like most of those conversations just being more educational. And I think it just kind of naturally happened to be that way because I mean, of course, you know, I think behavioral science is unique in that it has overlaps with everything. It's sort of this like meta process that encompasses everything. And so naturally, it just kind of happens in those conversations where there's like a new thing and then everyone wants to hear about the new thing. So yeah, but I wasn't expecting that. I hadn't gone in being like, hey, I'm only interested if this is changed into a behavioral science role. I was, you know, just doing my thing. And then, you know, midway through, they had given me the news that they decided to make it like a new thing. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite interview tips for folks is there's a tendency in interviews, I think, as you said, to sort of make it to feel like it's an assessment. You ask me a question and then I try and give you the answer that you want me to give you that will then get you to give me the job. But in reality, you know, the best way to answer those questions is as genuine, right? So if somebody says, how would you do this thing? You should treat it as like genuinely educate me on how you would do this thing. And because you took that approach, because you said, hey, let me educate you on how I would approach this, right? Then it created the opportunity to say, oh, well, maybe we'll just, rather than try to change Elizabeth to fit the role, we'll change the role to fit Elizabeth, which is always a wise, always bet on Elizabeth. That's interview tip number 2, always bet on Elizabeth. So you get in, and where are you situated in the org? Like we you know, so in the Jet world, you're living this multidisciplinary research, insights, data stuff, right? And then you come over to Spotify, and where in the org have they put you? How are you getting projects? Like, tell me a little bit about that. And I know that evolved in your time too. So let's start with sort of the initial version. We'll talk about the evolution.
Yeah, definitely. There were many organizational iterations, not just for the role, but just kind of at large for the business unit that I had joined. And so with that context, initially it was the Spotify is like divided up into different verticals called business units. And then the business unit that I joined was called the free business unit. So it had everything to do with the free version of the app. And within that world lived the messaging experimentation team and platform. And so initially I joined that team. So I was embedded within messaging experimentation. And so it was working with people who were building the platform and also working with stakeholders using the platform. And then within that, we had a remit to work on goals that basically went up into the free stratosphere, like, get people to try out a podcast for the first time, like engage more with podcasts and those kinds of things. So for the first, I would say, like half year, I got to really focus on working with a product manager and a data scientist on just like churning out messaging experiments and creating sort of like demonstration examples of behavioral science in action.
And was there a robust experimentation engine already in place, or you're sort of building the plane as you're flying it, or are you feeding the hopper of a machine that's already there, or you're building the machine at the same time?
So by the time I joined, the machine was like, it was functioning, but there was still work being done on making it more usable and useful and things like that. So it worked. It was kind of clunky. They were working on making it less clunky, but for all intents and purposes, it worked. So we were focused on just like doing the experiments and working on other things related to the messaging experience.
So you're generating ideas that go into the hopper of the machine. You're evaluating the results that come out of the machine. Anything, any notable things that you loved from that, from or let's call Epoch 1 of Spotify, right? Things you ran, things you enjoyed.
Yeah, that was probably my favorite time there, getting to just churn things out. Still on vacation brain mode, but one experiment that comes to mind that, well, actually, there's two that I might go into. So one I really liked was it was like a progress framing sort of thing. So imagine you're listening to a podcast episode and you stop like 60% of the way through, and it could be because you hate the show and you're done with it, or maybe the weekend hit and things got busy, and there's tons of different reasons. So we wanted to jump in and see if we might be able to nudge people to finish an episode. So we did a fun one where it was like, hey, tap to jump back in, you're 60% of the way through this episode, versus, hey, tap to jump back in, you have 40% left. And so seeing, the sort of glass half full, half empty effect and how that affected people was a really fun one. And then there was another one. Oh, I love bringing this one up when it comes to like larger talks and I'm actually presenting the results and the slides and everything, because it was actually like, a rather straightforward design. We're testing, we're trying to get people to re-opt in to push notifications. Those are people who missed the chance to really get to opt in. And there's a lot of research showing people actually like push notifications from Spotify because it's like new music artist updates, different from a lot of other apps. And so there was a very clear reason to go in and like get people to opt in. Because in the beginning, you just kind of like, you're going through the sign up flow and it comes up for a second and people don't even realize what they've clicked away. So we want to get them a chance. Yeah.
I'm that person that's just automatically hitting no. And I do sometimes regret it. We ran a pilot at Clover that involved Apple Watches, and my whole team, so we had to wear an Apple Watch for a week. And I was like, this thing is dumb. My whole team loved them. And I was like, this thing is dumb. And what we realized was I just had shut off every notification on my phone. And so the Apple Watch essentially never did anything because nothing was allowed to notify me. It didn't, text messages, nothing could notify. So I'm that person. But you're probably right. There are notifications like Spotify where it is a strong prompt to a thing that I enjoy. It's not niggling me about something I don't care about. It's, it's prompting me to something I genuinely enjoy, which is music. So I could see where this makes a lot of sense.
Right. Like giving people the active choice to really consciously pick and choose what they want. And so to do that, we had run a couple different treatments. One was like, an anticipated, actually, no, it wasn't anticipated. It was an actual regret message. We had social proof. We had a generic message, which we always like to include because, just because like if you have a message, it might have an effect simply because it's a message and not because of anything for it. And so we have the generic message, and then we have a no message control. And so, very simple, straightforward design. But I remember, there were people in the product world at the time being like, what's the point of testing? Like, we know social proof works. There's research on it. You share that. We know that. So, like, why not just launch it out and do it? And lo and behold, the results of this experiment was fabulous, because the social proof message actually backfired against the generic message. Which was just like a, very simple do this, like no sort of theoretical principle applied. And then the best performing one was the anticipated regret. And so that one had like doubled opt-in rates, and then we projected the impact, and it was great. And so that one became like a really great example of like, here's why we test, because we don't actually know what's going to work with our specific population. And we actually saw this over and over again, like in a different context, like concerts and ticketing. We had tried some social proof things, and they also kind of had a backfiring effect. And so, as there's this sort of like perhaps an evolution of the masses that's also occurring at the same time as we're running these experiments. So yeah, a bit of a digression, but that was those were some ones I remember.
Not a digression at all. Really important, right? This is why, academic behavioral science and applied behavioral science are so different, right? Academic behavioral science in a controlled setting is trying to prove that something sometimes happens, or at least happens in this very controlled setting. But I noticed that Dan Egan joined the call with his majestic beard, right?
Hey,
and Dan has that, like, Dan has a long track record of like, well, worked in the lab, didn't work at Betterment, right? Like in our specific context didn't work. I also think, Elizabeth, I love that you called out the sort of, consumers are evolving. So you can, everybody bets on social proof, and suddenly people start recognizing this sort of dark pattern, and it starts to feel icky, and it starts to feel like a negative signal, and it starts to feel like, oh, I see that you're manipulating me here, right? And so, you kind of have to wonder if you'd run the experiment 10 years earlier at like some earlier proto Spotify, would you have had a different result? That I think goes to that need for continue. It's not just we test things once, but we need to continually test, which I know is a big part of how you think about, sort of multifactorial tests, is this continuous, ongoing sort of like, hey, we're setting ourselves up for whenever this doesn't work, we know what to do next, we know where to go.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one of the hot takes that I've come to believe in recent years, which is, I'm actually not that concerned about the replication crisis, which sounds terrible. If that's ever just taken out as a soundbite, there goes my career. But the reason I'm not that concerned is because, like you were saying, when you're running a continuous set of experiments in a particular population, well, in order to find out what works for who and why, just keep on running experiments on your population. And the generalizability question, of course, when you're an academic researcher and you're running experiments on students and trying to apply it to humanity and the rest of the world, that can definitely run into issues, and does. But like when you're an institution and you have a specific base of users who you're trying to help, and you keep on running experiments on them, and the results work on your population, and you just keep going, then you basically have a reliable way through the scientific method of getting things figured out. And I think the way to really figure out what works in the world at large is to have every institution just continue doing this, in government and in business, finding ways to join forces where it makes sense. Like, for example, when COVID happened, there was one project that we were so close to getting off the ground. It was a partnership between the CDC, the White House, and I was at the messaging experimentation program at the time. So we designed an experiment that would help us understand, like, how do we get people to actually engage with COVID content? Because at that time, every internet service was posting out a notification for, click here to see CDC guidelines. And so we had an behavioral experiment laid out, and it was so close to getting out there, but then there were, politics and risks and things like that, and it didn't go out. But had it gone out, like, I think that would have been such an amazing example of the ways, you can use behavioral science and experimentation between the private sector and the public sector to create social impact. Because I think at some point, people are always afraid of like manipulation, experimentation. They should be, and dark patterns are terrible. Like, we always had an ethical framework that we used when we were doing nudges, but I think there's also a responsibility to experiment, because when you know that there is a possibility out there that could be better, and you're not testing for that and aiming for that when you have all the resources and infrastructure, I think that's a moral failure in a way. Like, I think there's a moral impetus to experiment more, regardless of whether you're in the public or private sector.
Okay, we're 6 months in. There's
Yeah.
change. Change arrives. Tell me about the arrival of change.
So yeah, so 6 months, messaging experimentation platform, everything happens. And then suddenly the business unit just entirely changes. It completely pivots. It's no longer the free business unit. They take the messaging experimentation team out into a different part of the company, and now it is the advertising business unit. So that brings just a whole change of incentives and the set of incentives that run the business unit. And at the same time, they were building out a centralized insights team that would basically oversee different projects across the entire business unit. So basically going from embedded to a centralized insights team was one of the big changes that had happened. And so when that initially started out, there were some pandemic changes too. Before that, concerts and ticketing was like a big part of the group. But then, eventually when COVID hit, you don't want to be giving out concert tickets at that point. And so that also kind of got shut out. And so things became very different. Like, it was more, I don't know, just a little more, I guess, varied and a little less experimentation focused.
Are you still on a trio of, sort of a data scientist and a product manager, or did that also sort of blow up that sort of unit internally, and now you're working differently?
Yeah, everything had changed. So they pulled me into the centralized insights team, and that was like this big new exciting thing at the time. It came with a promotion, which was great because that was within like 6 months. All the things, fanfare, yada yada, and then the messaging experimentation team and everything that has to do with that is now in another business unit. So it's sort of like sayonara in a lot of ways. Of course, there are relevant projects, like the platform is open to everybody to use, but it came with like a big change in incentives. So yeah, that's kind of the new setup now. So now it's me and user researchers and data scientists and analytics engineers. And so the group now had sort of a two-pronged goal and way of looking at things. So one purpose was to build out data products and data sets for the rest of the insights team to use. So there was that sort of like internal resource for the insights people aspect, those sort of meta aspect. And then there was also the research arm, which was me and the user researchers. There was also data viz people as well. I'm like putting the pieces back together from the past. And so that was sort of the setup, and there were sort of two lanes: research and building data sets and data products.
Got it. And are you still working on a robust experimentation engine, or what does your individual role start to look like, maybe differently than messaging?
So at that point, it's it's different and not different at the same time. What really changed, I think, were the projects I was working on, because now it would range from working on there was the ad studio product, which basically helps advertisers launch ads. And so it has its own set of users, which were advertisers, that has its own thing. And then there were other remits at the time, like concerts and ticketing and getting people to engage with concerts from their musicians and things like that. And then just a smattering of other things. So it really vary. Sometimes it would be like one-off sorts of things. Other times it would be like a full partial embed. And so I think at that point, there was sort of the biggest ability to discover and explore different ways of working for different kinds of problems and sets.
Got it. And I know this was you said, hey, the first Epoch was really an Epoch I loved. What were some of the challenges of the second Epoch, as you're sort of looking at like a really different group, really different remit, really different group of people? Where did you feel challenged, and how did you meet some of those challenges? Is this where sort of the factorial approach starts to come in? Like, what does this spur for you?
Yeah, I think this was sort of the pivoting point for more of that approach to, so I guess from the beginning, I'd always been like a big proponent of that approach, because with messaging experimentation and hundreds of millions of users, it often makes sense to jump into that territory. But where it really codified was when that switch happened, because there was this question of, usually when you're starting out in behavioral science, the first set of advice that you get from everybody is to rack up on those quick wins and demonstrate. And then you do that. And then you're like, okay, now what? And then you take the next step, and it's like, okay, well, take the process and really embed it into an entire function. That's sort of the next step from like the single intervention to the way an entire cross-functional organization works. And so then I did that, and then it was like, okay, now what? It happened a little quicker than I'd expected. There was sort of this like sense of, okay, well, once you do it and things are working, then it'll just naturally spread, I suppose. But got it to work, and then it was also this question of like, now what? And also, I think this is less applicable to like other people in the field, but also right around that time, after gotten things spread up, I had a surgery, and so I was out on medical leave for a bit, and so there was nothing I could really do about that. But coming back in and getting things going again, it still lended itself to this question of like, okay, now what? And so I think that's when it led into this sort of larger sort of attempt at putting things together in a way where even if you're not an executive chief behavioral officer or a team lead, like how do you still apply behavioral science in a way that the process is scaling across the company? Because if you're trying to figure out what works for who and why, currently the way it's done, it's like even when data science and user research and all the insights capabilities are used, it's often used as sort of like a icing on intuition. It's like people have the ideas already, and they're just kind of, and even if they're really trying to be database and data driven, and it's starting from there, at the end of the day, it's still kind of going into this kitchen sink optimization kind of role where it's like, okay, like we tried a thing, it didn't work, let's try another thing, and all of those interventions can't speak to each other. And I think this is where behavioral science frameworks are so important, like IDP, the 3Bs, the what have you, like, because at the core, every single one of them helps you figure out like what are the behavioral ingredients that are actually causing the change to happen. So how do you collect those ingredients, and then how do you distill those ingredients? And nobody's really doing that in a larger kind of scope. And I think that's where behavioral science is so important, because when you apply that kind of framework to just the way everything is working, then you can enter it all into a database of every intervention run in a specific area, have metadata on the barriers, the theories used, everything, and then use that data set as sort of this like additional product. And then I think that also, is the way to then answer that question of what works for who and why, because then you can bring in machine learning, run causal forests on actual experiment data, and then be able to personalize what works for who without sacrificing the why, which is absolutely huge. So there is a technical solution that isn't really being used. But even if you're not a company with scale where machine learning would make sense, just that database still makes a lot of sense, because it's this thing to point through that gives you this like meta visual into what's happening at large, and gives interventions a way to speak to each other and really build, versus being in this like constant kitchen sink optimization mode.
Yeah, I remember working with MasterCard, and one of the big unlocks for them was just making a spreadsheet where, we use behavioral statements, right? So there's a target audience and limitations, et cetera. We just made each of those a column on a spreadsheet, and then the rows were the projects they were running. So now you could sort of sort by columns, and you can say, oh, here are all of the things that we're doing that are on the same target audience. And then that would link off to the insights documents. So you could look at the insights from somebody else's project that was targeting the same group, or that had the same limitations, or wanted the same behavior. So they didn't. It's amazing how much time is spent essentially doing the same research over and over and over, on 8 different, because 8 different teams can't see what they're doing, especially in a company the size of Spotify, which is massive, right? There's a ton of waste there. I always think of behavioral science as behavioral science, well applied, is all about sustainability, right? Because it reduces overlapping waste. And so I think that is huge. We're really short on time, and you have so much left of your career. I want to talk a little bit about how the heck did you end up in politics, right? Like the spot. I know. You mentioned you had a health challenge at Spotify, right? Like you're kind of asking yourself, what next? And then the answer is politics. Like how did politics? Like how did running for office become the next thing for you?
Yeah, it really stemmed from the pandemic in a weird way because right around that time, I was really like, actually, I was in the messaging experimentation world, and then we were just in that sort of transition point. And it just became evidently clear that there was something that we could do that would have outsized impact with relatively minimal effort. Just setting up an experiment, getting the results, and then sharing those results with these government organizations. And at the same time, I also had a side project going on where we were doing exactly that. We were building out a COVID pledge system where people pledge to social distance and do various things. But the real value of that wasn't so much the pledge itself, but running it as an experiment, getting results on understanding that like actually self-focused frames kind of backfire and they don't do as well as like mentioning other people and you and other people. And, that's a very tangible insight that you can then share out. And we did that. And so at the same time, I was like, why don't we do this at Spotify where we have a platform of hundreds of millions of people? And public sector folks were very excited, gone to meetings, was ready to go, one button press away. But at the end of the day, there was that fear of, what if this becomes a PR nightmare, like Spotify running experiments during a time of crisis. But, to my previous point, I really do think there is this moral imperative to experiment when you have the means to be able to tap into what might be better. And so after that experience and reaching that sort of ceiling in a way, I realized like, you really have to be in the room at the table where it happens. Otherwise, you're always going to run into that ceiling, and companies are always going to be risk averse and, so on and so forth. And so around that time, I had already been thinking in that direction more systemically, but I hadn't jumped to like, therefore I must run for office. It was some people in a social impact community reached out to me and they were saying like, hey, we want someone who's like, big into evidence-based decision making. And in your district, the 10th Congressional District of New York City, the incumbent is reported and expected to retire, but not just retire in a normal way, but do so in a switcheroo kind of situation where they would run and at the very last minute pull out and then sort of appoint a successor. And by that point, if no one else is on the ballot, like it's basically their seat. And so it's an anti-democratic process that exists historically in New York that you can imagine why people in government don't get rid of. And so the idea was to just get on the ballot, make it a fair race, and give it a go. So it was a very calculated risk.
And do you think you'd run for office? Knowing what you know now, would you run for office? Like, what's next for Elizabeth Kim, right? Like, do we go back to a big company? Do we run a thing? Do you say, Matt, well, don't ask me these kinds of questions because I'm still working on it? Like, other than spending some time with us at BeSci.io and teaching behavioral science in the community more broadly, would you run for office again? Should we be looking for your name on a ballot?
I am really open to anything right now, but I do know one thing I do want to get off the ground before I do anything else is to take that process of like what works for who and why and building that into a system and really just get it out there into the world. Maybe some companies will bite. And if there's a company that's willing to partner and like really build out that system, that's something that I would love to do because I think it really gets at answering that larger question of like, how do you solve anything in this world? Because so much is behavioral and there are ways to conclusively get at a lot of these answers. So I think that's what I'll be doing for a little bit, and then to be continued. We'll see.
Well, and that process model part is so important. We have tons and tons and tons of cognitive models, right? Social psychology and others have developed all these models about how the brain works. And, no one, as pointed out by the author, but no one really understood, or the general public didn't understand. Like, we're not literally saying there's a system one and a system two, right? It's an analogy for how we think about these things. Tons of cognitive models, not that many process models, right? Like we have SIDE, right? The evolution of IDE, the strategy, insights, design, evaluation that we use at BeSci.io. You have things like the 3 Bs, which, aren't as are gesturing to a process model. They might not like fit on a 12-week sprint or something, but they're gesturing towards that model. More process models, I think, are really necessary and important. I love your factorial model. I love this idea of sort of codifying that and making it clear. And so I hope that we get to hear more about that, and maybe we'll get you to teach a class on the new education platform and that kind of stuff, and we'll get Elizabeth to spread the factorial model.
Sounds
but thank you so much for joining us. I love and admire and enjoy all the time we get to spend together. And so we'll be back next month with another speaker. Dan's here, and I sent Melanie a note. I was like, we got to get Dan Egan to do one of these too. This is the problem. We need to do one like every week. There are so many talented behavioral scientists. Thanks everybody for coming and being an awesome audience. Elizabeth, always fun to see you, and we'll see you on down the road. Goodbye, everybody.